Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Frontiers in Science deep dive webinar, exploring some questions that couldn't be more important right now. What can be done to stop the biodiversity loss that we're seeing around the world? What can be done to reverse and restore it? And how can we restore some stability to our Earth system? As you'll hear, today's authors suggest that the only way that we're going to meet our climate and developmental goals and deliver effective, equitable outcomes for people and nature is to shift to a nature positive approach. My name is Greg Foote. Hello, I am your moderator for today's session, which has people watching live from over 100 countries. That's absolutely fantastic. Hello. If you are new to Frontiers in Science, this is our flagship multidisciplinary open access journal at Frontiers. We publish exceptional peer-reviewed lead articles on transformational science key to accelerating solutions to the global challenges facing all of us and our planet. What we do is we build a unique hub around these lead articles, publishing a range of content around them to share their ideas with a whole broad range of audiences in a range of ways. Now, this unique approach extends the articles and the journal's reach and impact for a wide audience engaged with science, policy, and society. To date, we've published 34 of these unique hubs, spanning almost 130 articles covering a diverse spectrum of transformational science. This research has been cited over 1,500 times, it's been viewed over 4 million times, and it's regularly picked up by the media. Today's deep dive focuses on this lead article. It's titled Nature Positive, Halting and Reversing Biodiversity Loss Toward Restoring Earth System Stability. It's an interdisciplinary paper by a team of global co-authors led by Dr. Harvey Locke. And we are proud to give the article and its hub a home here in Frontiers in Science. The article explains how the Earth system, the interconnected land, water, air, and biodiversity that work together to make life possible, how that Earth system is becoming less stable. In part because nature is declining rapidly. It suggests that current conservation and sustainability efforts risk falling short if they continue to ignore the degradation of large-scale processes that are needed to sustain ecosystems. In their Frontiers in Science article, the authors argue that the nature loss must be halted now and reversed by 2030 through a global goal that they call nature positive. Now, this requires protecting remaining intact ecosystems and natural processes alongside urgent action to restore degraded areas. The authors assess how well the Come in Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, support this goal, and they identify key gaps, especially around some large-scale natural processes. In their framing, nature includes biodiversity patterns and the living and non-living processes that shape and sustain them. And they argue that the goal to halt and reverse nature loss should be pursued alongside urgent climate action because nature loss and climate change reinforce each other and increase the risk of reaching irreversible tipping points. As you'll hear, they also argue that nature positive is an economic and a financial issue because current incentives favour activities that actually degrade nature. Please do go deep dive into the full article hub after this session, where alongside the lead article, we also have an editorial by Professor Andrew Gonzalez from McGill University, Canada, a viewpoint article by Professor Carlos Alfredo Joly from the Brazilian Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and two policy outlooks, one by Marco Lambertini from the Nature Positive Initiative Switzerland, and the other by Doctors Eliane Ubalogjoro and Isaac Rutenberg from the Centre for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry in Kenya. The hub also has a lay explainer, a video, and a version of the lead article for Frontiers for Young Minds, which is our brilliant science journal for kids. Okay, now I've told you about Frontiers in Science, today's lead article and its hub, let me tell you about today's schedule. First, we're going to hear from the authors of the lead article, from Dr. Harvey Locke, then Professor Johan Rockström, and then Professor Rainer Plowright. Then we will have a panel discussion with the authors and two special guests, Dr. Eliane Ubalogjoro and Marco Lambertini, the authors of the Hub policy outlooks that I just mentioned. Our first speaker is the Vice Chair for Nature Positive for the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, Dr. Harvey Locke. Now, Harvey is a writer, a photographer, and a globally recognised leader in the fields of parks, wilderness, wildlife, and large landscape conservation. He is a founder of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, a visionary effort to maintain an ecologically connected wildlife corridor stretching from Wyoming to the far north of Canada. And he is the co-founder of the Nature Needs Half movement, which makes the scientific case for protecting at least half of Earth's lands and water to safeguard biodiversity and climate stability. Harvey is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. He lives in Banff National Park, where his family has deep roots, and he was named one of Canada's leaders for the 21st century by Time magazine. Harvey, thank you again for bringing this article to Frontiers in Science. The floor is yours.
We live in a time of dynamic change. The natural world as we know it is unraveling. The climate is changing. Human development goals are not being met. And perhaps most psychologically important is that there is a general malaise around all of this. Nature positive is an idea that is a solution to that malaise. It's a positive idea. It's a vision that can be realized through measurable steps that can take us to an optimistic future, one that integrates biodiversity, addressing the climate crisis, and addressing human development goals. Our paper, as mentioned, is interdisciplinary, and I want to acknowledge the team of co-authors from around the world that worked very hard to put it together. Today, we will address a few dimensions of it. The big idea, how we need to think about biodiversity not as a luxury, but as an essential thing for human well-being and for a stable 21st century. Let me begin with discussing the origins of the nature positive idea and definition. First off, the nature positive idea was created by a group of us, we called the CEOs group, to come up with something that was analogous to the Convention on Biological, the carbon neutrality goal of the Paris Agreement and the equitable development goals of the SDGs, and to be integrated with them. The first paper that launched the idea into the world defined the idea, and it also was written by CEOs of a number of the largest global organizations. So in April 2021, we defined the idea as halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030 from a 2020 baseline to ensure full recovery of nature by 2050. It was intended to and did influence the mission of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, whose mission is now to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 on the way to achieving the vision of restoring a healthy planet. I want to stress the importance of halting loss. When you're in a hole, the first thing you do is you stop digging. Then you can start filling the hole. But if we keep digging the hole, no amount of filling or restoration is going to get us there. We have to stop the loss of primary systems. So first, a basic conceptual thing. Nature positive and the Earth system are deeply interconnected. You'll hear later from Johan about planetary boundaries and Earth system science. That's the problem. Nature positive is a normative goal, part of the solution. And the goal here is to try to get us out of the destabilized Anthropocene with nature actions combined with climate and human development actions that get us into a more stable future than we are now, because we're going in the wrong direction. First, a basic conceptual point. We need to think about our goals differently than we do now. The enlightened goal framework that a lot of people work from is this SDG framework. A Venn diagram of competing interests searching out the sweet spot of sustainable development, where everything interacts and we find ourselves in a narrow zone of overlap. This is actually wrong. The society, economy, environment are not competing interests. We need to make a nature positive conceptual shift. The environment, or the Earth system, is the context for everything. It's the context for everything humans do. And the economy is a subset of human society. They are not competing interests. If we don't get the Earth system stable and keep it stable, human society will have great difficulties and the economy will unravel. This hierarchical shift is essential for us to get the future right. Now, how do we think about that? Well, biodiversity is often only thought about at one scale, how many species we have. Sometimes we think about it with the definition of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which includes ecosystems. But too often we just think about species and their interactions. We don't also think about the interaction with the abiotic component, such as rivers. And we rarely think about the third scale of biodiversity, even though it's in the global goal for the GBF, it's in the Rio Principles, and that is, how does this all contribute to a healthy planet? And this is where large-scale natural processes and Earth system feedbacks come in. And we have to think across all three scales of biodiversity to understand why it's so essential to our well-being. At a basic level, this is how the Earth works. There are global processes. And the way that life was set up on Earth was with the interaction of the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. They gave rise to biodiversity. And right away, biodiversity, as it occurred, started to become a feedback to that system. Some of you may have heard of the Great Oxygenation Event, which is a great example of biodiversity feeding back and actually changing the atmosphere completely from anoxic to oxic. This in turn sets up human benefits. Humans benefit from this system, the system of global processes and biodiversity, which is a feedback and part of those global processes. So, for example, the Climate Convention says the climate is the interaction of the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the geosphere. And that is where biodiversity is essential to the climate situation. Our problem is that for most of human history, we interacted just fine with that system. But now we're becoming, because of our impact on biodiversity, our actions are becoming a negative feedback to those global processes. Too much destruction of nature exacerbates the climate crisis. Too little resilience in nature makes it impossible for us to adapt to the climate crisis, and so on. What we need to do is move away from being a negative feedback to being a positive feedback, a nature positive feedback, so that humanity's actions start to restabilize those global scale processes. So this is the essence of why biodiversity is fundamental to how the Earth functions. We need to think about not only patterns, where biodiversity is, which is a great focus of biodiversity science and very important, but we also need to think about the processes, because it's the process scale that we begin to see these interactions, and where biodiversity is no longer something nice to look at, but something fundamental to our well-being. In our paper, we address this in a variety of ways. We'll talk about a number of these topics today, but we won't have time to spend a lot of time on freshwater hydrology and the connection to the ocean. Vitally important in the paper. The other topics here will be covered. One of the ways to think about the challenges is not everywhere is the same. You know, we tend to have debates in conservation about, well, species conservation of endangered species is most important. Oh, no, no, no. We need to save the largest, wildest places left in the world because that's more important. Oh, no, no. There's a sweet spot in between where we can have our cake and eat it too, internet-connected systems of corridors and so on, and we can focus on that because we can keep wildness and humans in the landscape. And the answer to that is we need to do all of that simultaneously at once. One is not more important to the other. It all matters. But the scales at which these things apply are a little different. In the cities and farms of the world, where the world is heavily transformed, saving endangered species and doing whatever we can to keep pollutants out of rivers and so on is vital. In the shared landscape, which is about half the world, where we have large protected areas, we have wild areas, we also have logging, mining, people grazing their animals, some rural communities, we need to think about those interconnected systems. And in the large wild areas of the world, about a quarter of it, we need to keep them wild. We need to keep them intact. That is the goal, because they contribute fundamentally to how the world functions. We also need to think through governance and integration, and our paper covers this in some significant degree. We will be talking about the Indigenous and the nature positive perspective and other cultural perspectives in a different webinar that the University of Ottawa is hosting, and equitable approaches to conservation, which are vital, but not will be the focus of today. But we will also talk about the importance of integrating these conventions in the paper, but we'll not be focusing on that today. But we will talk about this natural capital and making nature investable idea a little bit more later in the webinar. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Harvey. Thanks, Harvey, for those insights and for setting the scene for today's discussion. So let me invite our next speaker. He is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, Professor Johan Rockström. Now, Johan has more than 25 years of applied research in tropical water systems. His work bridges fundamental science and real-world impact across land management, freshwater resources, and global sustainability. Johan is internationally recognised for his work on global sustainability issues, and he led the development of the landmark Planetary Boundaries Framework, a scientific foundation for understanding how human pressures are pushing Earth's life support system towards critical tipping points, a concept now central to global sustainability policy and governance worldwide. He is the chair of the Earth Commission and the Earth League, the chief scientist of Conservation International, and one of the world's most influential voices on planetary stewardship. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us, Johan. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Greg, and great to be with you. And I'll be complementing Harvey's great summary here by basically providing the scientific evidence that the living biosphere today regulates the stability, the resilience, and life support on the entire Earth system, and that we're now putting this stability at risk. Now we have one key, or rather two fundamental processes that we today understand regulates the resilience and stability of the Earth system. The first one is what you see here, which is the energy balance on planet Earth. The observations and modeling data we have showing that roughly 90% of the heat that we inject through our fossil fuel burning and greenhouse gases is not in the atmosphere causing the climate crisis where we're today inevitably going into overshoot and exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature rise. No, 90% of the heat is actually stored in the ocean. 5% is absorbed in soils and land biomass. 4% is consumed to melt ice, which means that a fundamental provider of resilience of the planet is the functioning of the biotic and abiotic systems on Earth that regulates the capacity to absorb heat. But we also have the second large, so here you have basically how a stable planet operates, absorbing the same amount of incoming heat as it returns back to space. And it's the energy imbalance that we're causing by trapping greenhouse gases, which is then interacting with the living biosphere, causing the energy imbalance on planet Earth. And the imbalance today is so significant that we are plowing ahead towards a point where the path we're following will actually bring us to beyond the limits of adaptation and potentially catastrophic outcomes for humanity. This is driven, as we know, by the great acceleration and the hockey sticks of massive exponential rise in pressures from the mid-1950s onwards. The great acceleration is today very well established. To the left, you see the socioeconomic pressures, but to the right are all the exponential pressures on the Earth system. And we tend, unfortunately, to focus only on the non-living parts of this, the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases and pollution pressures. But we also have the equivalent curves. They look exactly the same for the loss of the living parts of the Earth system, which in the end are those that determine the outcome of the stability of the planet. And of course, the lower curve on this graph is the one that we're most concerned of, which is the loss of living species, of the functions in nature that Harvey so well documented. Is this something we need to be fundamentally considering as an existential threat? I would argue that the answer is yes, and we have the data here as well. What you see here is the paleoclimatic data from ice cores showing the last 12,000 years since we left the last ice age. On the y-axis is global mean surface temperature on planet Earth. The zero line is the pre-industrial 14 degrees Celsius. And just look at this extraordinary stability of the equilibrium state of the Earth system since we left the last ice age, the Holocene. This is a 14 degrees Celsius planet, plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius of average temperature variability, which I call today a corridor of life. It's a corridor of life because it's during this very narrow stability of the Earth system we've developed the world as we know it. So everything that we cherish with regards to stable biomes, stable freshwater cycle, marine diversity, all the natural capital that forms the basis for human well-being and stable societies have evolved within this very narrow corridor. And then off we go in this exponential spike, as you see to the left-hand side, and in the enlargements to the right, you see the journey we're following. We are following a pathway that would take us to 3 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century, a place we haven't been in for the past 4 million years, which is nothing less than a path to disaster. And we today understand that what will determine whether we avoid that point or end up in that disastrous point is not only the energy transition, meaning phasing out oil, coal, and gas, it's also our ability to return within the safe operating space for nature, which is biodiversity, biome configuration, fresh water, and fundamental composition of the biosphere. Now, this in turn raises also a risk, which is fundamentally concerning for us, which is that we are starting to see an acceleration of warming on planet Earth. Just look at the curves here. To the left, you see the atmospheric rise of temperatures, which is 1970 until mid 2014, 2015, have been following a very dangerous linear relationship between more greenhouse gases leads to more warming, which has led us to the conclusion that we have a global climate crisis on our watch. But then look at what's happening in the last decade, both in the ocean to the right and in the atmosphere to the left. We see an acceleration of the warming. And unfortunately, even though science has not been able to fully explain this yet, this acceleration cannot be decoupled from our undermining of nature, that we are seeing very likely the first signs of an Earth system where the living biosphere is losing resilience, which then means a lowered capacity to absorb the carbon that we are emitting. And you have the evidence from the global carbon budgets each year. And here you have from 1850 until today. On the y-axis is billion tons of carbon dioxide. Above the zero line is the hockey stick I showed you before on fossil fuel burning and land degradation. Is it the entire area under this curve, carbon dioxide loaded into the atmosphere, that has caused the energy imbalance and the climate crisis? The answer is no. Just look at the blue line and the green lines, which are the carbon dioxide uptakes in intact nature. This is the living biosphere providing the largest service to the global economy by buffering stress, by absorbing half of our debt to the climate energy imbalance we're causing. That is what you see in the blue residual in the lower part there. The drama is that unfortunately you cannot see this in this curve, so you have to believe me. We have more and more science showing that the carbon uptake capacity in terrestrial ecosystems on land is going down. Temperate forest, boreal forest, even tropical forest showing signs of tipping over from no longer being a sink, but transitioning gradually to becoming a source. Why is this happening? Well, it's loss of biodiversity, it is degradation of habitats, and it's temperature rise, and it's change in hydrology. Multiple planetary boundaries affecting the living biosphere, reducing their resilience. So fundamentally, this makes us come closer to tipping points in the Earth system. So this is the big drama. We're in the Anthropocene, putting pressures on the planet, undermining the resilience, but in a stable state, the planet is remarkably biogeochemically strong to buffer those stresses. But as that stress increases, the planet system reaches a saturation point and approaches tipping points. We've mapped the tipping points. Here you have them. 16 tipping point systems that we today scientifically understand contribute to regulate the stability of the Earth system. 6 of them are up in the Arctic system, most of them being cryosphere related. But you also have the big biomes. You have the Amazon rainforest, you have the ocean system, you have 3 down in Antarctica, the West Antarctic ice sheet being the one most of concern today, and the marine system's most rich ecosystem, the tropical coral reef system, livelihoods for over 400 million people. Here you have the list, 16 systems. We have for the first time been able to map the risks of crossing tipping points at what temperature. And just look at the top 6 here. You see an uncertainty range, which is the burning embers here. That is why science need to continue to get a better precision. But the points you see here are the median risk levels. And the median risks for several of these, as you see, lies between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius, which means that we are very close to crossing tipping points because we are now inevitably going to exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius point. And just look at the coral reef systems here, which is the third from the top, which has a very narrow uncertainty range. So we are actually having high confidence, unfortunately, that this is probably the first victim of living systems, the richest ecosystem in marine areas, very close to tipping points. If you go further down the list, you have the Amazon rainforest, fourth from the bottom. Very wide uncertainty. The climate science indicates that the risk of tipping is somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius, but the latest science shows we're wrong. Because if we factor in loss of biodiversity, changes in hydrology, and shifts in the canopy cover, the risk of crossing a tipping point in the Amazon basin, the planet Earth's richest biome on land, is probably or very likely somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So my conclusion, or the conclusion from science, is actually that planet Earth's 2 richest ecosystems in terms of natural biodiversity are very close to tipping. In marine systems, coral reef systems, on land, the Amazon basin. That's what we've reached. That's where we are. This is why we need the planetary boundaries to guide us, which are the 9 Earth system processes that scientifically are proven to regulate the stability of the Earth system. We quantify all the 9 to have a chance of remaining within the equilibrium state of the Holocene. 7 of the 9 are today assessed to be outside of this safe operating space. And as you see, it's not only climate forcing, it's also the biosphere boundaries of nature. Biosphere integrity, meaning biodiversity and ecological functions, land system configuration, the bloodstream of the whole Earth system, the hydrological cycle, and the biogeochemical flows of nitrogen, and even the ocean stability is today outside of its stable state. So this is why we today conclude in the annual planetary health check that we're no longer in a safe space. We're in this danger zone in yellow. The 2 lines here show the uncertainty range in science. So we're in danger, but it's not yet too late to turn this around. The planet is still, as Harvey pointed out, remarkable, with its living biosphere still dominated by dampening feedbacks, but we're starting to see dangerous cracks in the system, and we must turn this around very rapidly. And that transformation is what this is all about. Nature positive and the energy transition are the 2 fundamental pathways that need to be secured to enable to have this blue marble still as a livable, fundamental place in support of life support. And with that, thank you very much. And back to you, Craig, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Johan. Worrying, as you say, in danger, but not yet too late. That's what we're addressing today. So thank you for those insights into why it's so important to take this Earth system view of nature positive. On to our third speaker, last but not least. Professor in the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health at Cornell University, USA, Professor Rainer Plowright. Now, Rainer's research focuses on understanding how zoonotic diseases, so diseases spread from animals to humans, may spill over to inform strategies and international policy for pandemic prevention. She leads large transdisciplinary collaborations to tackle complex problems regarding emerging disease biology, with a focus on WHO priority pathogens originating in bats. Her multi-scale studies have revealed how land use change and climate variation drive the emergence of infectious diseases and how spillovers can be prevented. Raina holds several advisory board roles, including the National Science Foundation Advisory Committee for Environmental Research and Education, and she is the co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Prevention of Viral Spillover. Welcome, Raina. The floor is yours.
I'm going to be talking about the importance of nature for human health, and particularly by explaining why protecting nature is critical to preventing the next pandemic. Pandemics are often framed as biomedical problems, but actually all pandemics, almost every pandemic, has begun with a spillover from a wild animal in an ecological system. And spillover, as Greg had described before, is the passage of a pathogen from an animal to a human. And it actually involves the alignment of many different factors that all have to happen at the same point in space and time. Firstly, you need to have a reservoir host, and that reservoir host has to have some overlap with the recipient, whether that's a human or a domestic animal, bridging host. That host has to be infected with the pathogen of concern, and releasing that pathogen either through shedding, slaughter, or a vector, the pathogen has to be able to survive in the environment for long enough for exposure to occur for the next host. And that exposure often involves, for humans particularly, some kind of a behavior. And also that human needs to be susceptible to that particular pathogen. And that often involves things like receptor binding. And if all of those things come together, we have spillover. But many of the processes I just described are very dynamic in space and time. And so spillover is it's a perfect storm event. It's the alignment of everything at that exact moment in space and in time. And what humans do is we shift these barriers so that alignment is made more possible. And so this perfect storm event, it's not just a random accident, it's a complex system failure. Currently, the way that we respond to these events is on the right-hand side of this diagram. We respond once a pathogen's already circulating in humans. What we're focused on is trying to actually move to the left and try to actually stop the spillover event, stop that pathogen from entering the human population in the first place. We call that primary pandemic prevention. I'm going to give you a case study to show how this works. This is Hendra virus in Australia, and advance here. Hendra virus it's a virus that is hosted by fruit bats, so we call them flying foxes. These are large migratory bats that feed on nectar, and when these bats that are infected with the virus come and roost and feed in trees in horse pastures, they can contaminate the grass with infected urine. And if horses come along and consume that infected pasture, then the horses can become infected. And for horses, there's an 80% fatality rate. And then horses can then give the virus to humans with a 60% fatality rate. Interestingly, the bats are not affected by the virus. They do not get sick. So we've been trying to understand the emergence of this virus. Now, one thing that's really interesting to think about is that this virus is present across much of the eastern part of Australia. The bats are present across eastern Australia. Horses are present across the eastern part of Australia. Yet we only see spillover events in this really small part of the subtropics of Australia. And to understand why that is, we've been going on to properties where horses have been infected and investigating those events. And what we expected to find when we went onto these properties was evidence of the reservoir host, these nomadic nectivores. We expected to see evidence of large populations of the reservoir host because they historically would aggregate in these huge populations and move across the landscape looking for pulses of nectar in native forests. And so coming onto these properties, of course, what we thought we'd see were many, many of these bats. And this is just showing you the distribution of where we've seen the cases of Hendra virus on the left there. And we've only been seeing clusters of these viral outbreaks actually since around 2006. We've seen many cases. So we did go onto these horse properties, but interestingly, what we saw were not many, many bats, and not the casings of all of these flowers as what we would have expected, but rather we saw evidence of very few bats and bats eating really poor foods. These are weedy species that have very little nutritional value, what we call starvation avoidance food. So that was our first clue. Our second clue came by talking with bat carers in the areas of the spillovers. And the bat carers said that it was really curious that just before we had the spillover events, we had large numbers of baby bats coming into care because the mothers, being nutritionally stressed, were abandoning their pups. And then we started to talk to beekeepers, and this gave us our third clue. Beekeepers said at the same time that these bats were coming into care, they couldn't find anywhere to put their hives. There was no nectar in the landscape. So at this point, we then understood that we're having these periodic collapses of nectar across the landscape that's affecting the bats and the bees. It took us some time to figure out that those periodic nectar shortages were almost always preceded by a strong El Nino event. And we understand the biology of the trees that the bats feed on is that when there's hot, dry conditions, such as after El Nino, the buds don't set, and then about 9 months later, the flowers don't appear, and there's a food shortage in the environment. At the same time that bats were having these periodic acute short-term food shortages, they are also sustaining this long-term loss of habitat. And it's particularly this critical habitat that feeds the bats in winter, just 5 species of trees that flower that have almost entirely disappeared now mostly because of agriculture in the subtropics. At the same time, we started to lose these big aggregations from hundreds of thousands of individuals, and we started to just see small groups of bats. And in particular, we saw what those bats moving into cities and farms. So rather than feeding in native forests, now finding new types of foods in areas where humans are and in proximity to horses. And what we understand is why we started to see outbreaks around the early 2000s is because at that point we had bats in proximity to horses in farmlands. And so when they'd have the additional stress of these food shortages, we would then see these clusters of Hendra virus outbreaks that would follow these food shortages. And using that understanding, we could start to predict most of the outbreaks of Hendra virus, but not all. And in particular, in 2020, we had all of the conditions align for spillover, and we actually didn't see spillovers, but we had teams in the field and we started to look, and that was when the next clue came to understanding the system. So our field teams went looking to see what was happening with the bats, and what we found was that a remnant patch of native vegetation of winter flowering habitat had produced an incredibly productive pulse of nectar, and a huge number of bats actually left the cities and farms and gone back to feed in that native forest. Actually, 3/4 of one species was found just at that one pulse of native forest. That inspired us to go back through our data of 25 years of data. And what we found was that every time there was a pulse of flowering in native forest, there had never been a spillover event. And with those data, we then could start to predict spillovers. But to try to understand why this was the case, we've been looking at the movement of bats. And here, every dot is a bat tracked by radar. And this is during a period where there was no native food. You can see that the bats are each doing their own thing, each feeding in agricultural landscapes, and many of their feeding stops will be in horse pastures. We then tracked bats when there was a pulse of nectar, and that forest patch there is a flowering winter habitat. And here you can see 70,000 bats leaving their roost and beelining to that native forest. In this condition, there's no possibility of spillover because those bats are not feeding near horses. So then with this additional information, we could actually correctly predict each cluster of Hendra virus spillover, but it also gave us this idea of a way of we could actually prevent spillover, as well as protecting what winter flowering habitat is remaining. We should be replanting those forests, and that could draw these bats away from these cities and farmlands. So there's a great deal of attention right now on 2 infectious disease events. hantavirus that was associated with a cruise ship, and Ebola in Central Africa. And just like hantavirus, these two events started with a spillover from wildlife in a natural system. And in both cases, human activity and ecological disruption has probably contributed to that spillover event. So let's start with hantavirus. So hantavirus is carried by a forest-dwelling mouse, but it's also a mouse that does well in disturbed and urban habitats near humans. And across many rodent-borne diseases, increasing rodent populations are a really important risk for spillover. And the processes that increase rodent populations are simplification of ecological systems through the loss of biodiversity, particularly through the loss of predators. It's fragmentation and it's disturbance. And we've seen other infectious disease systems driven by this process, most notably Lyme disease in the northeastern United States, but also potentially Mpox in Central Africa. And then we have Ebola in Central Africa. And while the current outbreak of the Bundibugyo strain of the Ebola virus is most likely being amplified by disinvestment in health infrastructure, by conflict, by inequalities, the epidemic began with a spillover from a wildlife host. And what we understand from Ebola is that spillover Ebola is linked to increasing access of humans to intact ecosystems. It's linked to fragmentation, road expansion, mining, and conflict. So these three systems actually show us a common pattern of how spillover risk increases as we alter ecosystems. So the hantavirus system shows us how climate variability and loss of habitat push animals into cities and farms, where stress, food stress, and proximity then drive spillover. The hantavirus outbreak shows us how loss of biodiversity can increase spillover risk. And the Ebola virus outbreak shows us how when humans fragment and penetrate large intact areas, we can have these events. So the nature-based way of disease prevention would be to protect intact ecosystems, restore degraded habitats, and reduce risky overlap among wildlife, livestock, and people. But the most fundamental form of pandemic prevention will be protecting intact ecosystems before ecological degradation creates the conditions and interfaces for spillover. And I want to say this is particularly important for something what we call pathogen X. And that is the undiscovered pathogen that is probably circulating in nature right now that hasn't yet found an interface to transmit to humans. This is the next pandemic virus that just hasn't had those right conditions align. And that should be a real priority to reduce the probability that those conditions happen. Preventing even just one major pandemic would offset decades of investment in habitat protection, ecological restoration, and spillover prevention. And so ecological prevention is not only biologically plausible, it's also economically strategic. So I want to leave you with this, that leaving intact systems intact may be one of the most cost-effective public health investments available to humanity. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Harvey.
Thank you so much, Raina, for those insights into zoonotic disease and human health. Harvey, over to you to wrap up with some key economic considerations.
What I will talk about now briefly is what Raina just said and what Johan just said, which is our endeavors, including our economy, are dependent on a stable Earth system. And in simple terms, what Raina just said, think back to the economic impact of a pandemic. Our economy is dependent on a healthy Earth system, period. Not competing with it, wholly dependent. I'm going to give one example, going to the Amazon tipping point that Johan talked about. We have to change all kinds of economic conditions, which are outlined in our paper, to get to a nature positive future. I'm going to focus on the one specific to the Amazon that really gets the point across. So this is the primary Amazon rainforest, intact ecosystem. It consists of a canopy, emergent trees, and you see that moist looking stuff? That's not fog. That's the forest raining on itself, a biome function doing evapotranspiration, green water to the sky that creates rain. It's extraordinary, but the forest rains on itself. And over through the Amazon, first rainfall from the ocean, then a recycling of moisture all the way until the Andes, where something like 2/3 of it is a process like this video. This is a flying river or an atmospheric river of moisture that drives the health of the Amazon forest itself and affects the regional climate and precipitation, vital to the entire South American continent. Here is a harpy eagle that lives in the emergent canopy, only on top of emergent trees, only survives if there's at least 50% of its habitat intact. And the key point here is that harpy eagles control, just like Raina talked about predators controlling mice and spreading disease, harpy eagles control leaf eaters. The evapotranspiration process is from leaves, from stomata releasing water vapor to the atmosphere. The whole system, biodiversity, the trees, the age, the primary nature of the large biome drives this marvelous process that we get for free, but which we cannot function without. When we cut the forest down, we put that system at risk. There's no clear definitive threshold for at what point it shuts down, but there's a working number of 20% deforestation would shut that process down. If you shut that process down, then the rainfall stops, not just for the Amazon, but for the Rio de la Plata Basin to the south, which is the major economic heartland of South America. You also, when you shut it down, you degrade the carbon storage capacity. We have this idea that planting trees is the solution to climate change. Yes, but not the primary. And the primary one is to leave it alone. And the bottom left-hand corner of this slide shows it. The reforested areas that have been degraded in the Amazon have only recovered 1/3 of the carbon lost through degradation. We need to not degrade these primary systems. And if you look at if there's a tipping point in the Amazon, if that forest shuts down, we lose one of the largest food and crop producing regions in the world, which has an economic impact not just in South America, but around the world. It also has a devastating effect on the hydrological generating capacity of South America. These are economic studies showing losses of revenue in the billions and hundreds of millions in the Rio de la Plata Basin associated with the Amazon. So what taking an economic perspective, this holistic perspective does, is we shift thinking about just saving the wonders of the Amazon, which is enough motivation for me, to understanding that the Amazon tipping point is an economic and financial issue that we can address through financial instruments such as insurance, where we can imagine insuring ourselves against this loss and investing in saving the Amazon forest. And there's a project called Arctic, which is trying to achieve that. And so when we rethink our relationship with nature and the economy and society in a nature positive way, we can imagine new financial solutions, and we need to do that across the board. There are some really interesting points where we need to move from economic value. We know ecosystem services have value. We now need to make them financialized so you can invest in them or you can insure yourself against them. There's ideas like natural capital accounting, putting nature on the balance sheet. And IPSAS 51 is an extraordinary new thing. It's a global public accounting standard that would allow protected areas to move from expenses in national accounts to being investments in the strength of the country's financial system. This is huge, just got approved in January. I believe this is a really important frontier for keeping nature intact. And here's the key point. All financial capital in the world is at risk if we continue to degrade the Earth system. It's therefore in the interest of private capital to support and invest in nature positive actions. We need to align all of our systems to get to this nature positive, carbon neutral, equitable future that can give us a stable, a more stable Anthropocene and get us back into that corridor Johan talked about. So back to you, Greg.
Thanks, Harvey. Thanks very much. I'm sure there's going to be a couple of questions to you later about some more of the economic considerations. So those are our three authors that have spoken. It's now time to put your questions to them. But I'd like to welcome two more guest panelists to join us before we do that. The first is a co-author of one of the policy outlooks on the lead article, a scientist and a leader at the intersection of forests, food systems and sustainable development, Dr. Eliane Ubali-Joro. Eliane is the first African woman to lead a consortium of international agricultural research centre, directing one of the world's foremost institutions on forestry, agroforestry and landscape restoration across the global south. Appointed by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, Eliane serves on the independent group of scientists preparing the 2027 Global Sustainable Development Report. And in 2025, Reuters named her one of 12 trailblazing women in climate, recognising her exceptional contribution to science-led global action. Welcome, Eliane. And alongside Eliane, our final guest today is the convener of Nature Positive Initiative Switzerland, Marco Lambertini. Marco is a leading voice in international conservation, driving efforts to halt and reverse nature loss and shape global biodiversity agendas. Prior to his role as the convener of the Nature Positive Initiative, he served as Director General of WWF International, later as Special Envoy and as CEO of BirdLife International. With a career spanning ecological field research to high-level policy and advocacy, Marco has worked across continents on nature reserve management, integrated conservation and development, and environmental education. His experience in NGO development, communications, and campaigning has helped advance a bold vision for a resilient, equitable future and mobilise cross-section action for people and nature. Welcome, Marco. Let me start with a question to each of you. Let me put one first to Eliane. Eliane, your policy outlook with the Centre for International Forestry Research team reframes nature as the foundation of development, not a constraint on it. Tell us briefly about that.
What we really see is really the importance of how do we look at the actions that are being taken at the national level, and how do they really allow us to have the clearest way to turn nature positive into national development pathways. And so within this scope, agroforestry mandates are critical, which is the work we do around agroforestry, and AFR 100 is one of the powerful restoration platforms. So we really see that the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Platform plans, NBSAPs, are really critical in terms of the efforts to make sure that policy framework are aligning and not working separately in silos. And so this is an area that we see as really key, and our science really looks at forests, farms, rangelands. I also noticed some people talking about grasslands in the chat. We recently had an event on grasslands, really celebrating the critical importance of the biodiversity they hold. So we really see that, how we're looking at that intersection of making NBSAPs practical, evidence-based, and investable by linking biodiversity action to food security, water security, climate resilience, and livelihoods are really key to growing local economies. And so that integration is really important to ensure that national operating systems for nature positive development are really integrating the elements of agroforestry and restoration to serve as engines on the ground.
And just because you mentioned AFR 100 there, I was reading about that. It's a cross-Africa initiative to restore 100 million hectares of deforested and degraded land by 2030. Just tell us a little bit more about that, and also the national roadmaps that have kind of been outlined for how we get there.
So one of the key things is, if you look at AFR 100, it's within the global agenda of how are we restoring 1 to 2 billion hectares of land around the world? How are we partnering with governments, with private sector, and how are we ensuring that, communities are at the center and that the work they do at the interface of ecosystem restoration, of value chains, is really serving the restoration agenda. And so we really need to look at that interface, that how we're looking at restoration has to be stewarded by local economies so they can ensure we're looking at nature positive economic growth that serves the interest of indigenous populations and local communities. And so that's really critical. So how we link that to economic growth, to private sector, and to unlocking finance is really key. And so that's really central to the work of AFR 100.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Thank you, Eliane. And now to you, Marco. In Namibia, I believe we've got limited time on your battery and your signal, so we'll see how this goes. In your policy outlook, you argue that we need a nature measurement protocol that follows a similar model to how we measure greenhouse gases. So if you had to pick 2 or 3 metrics that companies must report, what would they be?
Thank you, Greg. Apologies, I'm on my phone, and I hope the connection holds. I'm in the field. Look, let me just frame the context a little bit, because today we have about 800 different metrics available for biodiversity, straight metrics, composite metrics, indexes, which is fantastic for people like us, because we've never been able to measure biodiversity better than today. But it is truly intimidating and confusing for users out there that we want to start measure their transition towards nature positive outcomes. And so measuring, it's absolutely fundamental. And in order to make sure that that is leading to mass adoption, not to the limited adoption of metrics that we are seeing today, particularly in the corporate sector, where the pressure on biodiversity is obviously the highest, we need to actually admit that right now the situation is too complex, and we need to embrace a framework of metrics, indicators and metrics that are accessible, more accessible to the private sector, but honestly to other actors like communities, Eliane mentioned, in order to be able to measure credibly, but also in a practical and accessible way, an affordable way, progress towards nature positive outcomes. If you ask me what are those metrics, out of the 1,000, I mean, look, we had run for a year and a half a large consultation with all the users you can imagine of, and we kind of landed on 4 no-brainer indicators, no-brainers. Ecosystem extent, ecosystem condition, so the health of the condition of the ecosystem, the species extinction risk, because extinction is forever, and very important, species population, because actually sometimes are the most abundant population species that are the most ecologically functionally important. So those are the 4 indicators when you attach relative metrics. But last thing to say is that for particularly the private sector, but for many other stakeholders, for which biodiversity is a new topic in terms of materiality, in terms of linking biodiversity to development, linking biodiversity to projects and business models. This is the majority of the players, particularly in the private sector. Imagine that only 10% of the Fortune Global 500 companies, only 10% have set some sort of targets for biodiversity. 80% have targets on climate. We are slow, they are not maybe delivering, but the journey started. So we need to encourage the journey to start on biodiversity too. And for that, we need to abandon perfection and embrace good enough in terms of credibility, good enough in terms of practicality, and accept that is a journey through which stakeholders will move towards more sophistication over time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marco. I'm glad you gave us those key 4, not the whole 1,000. But yeah, you're right. Okay, let me put as many of your questions to our incredible panel as I can. So quick questions, quick answers panel. Harvey, I'll chuck one at you first. Let's explore first this kind of theme about integrating global frameworks. So recognizing this shift from seeing nature as something to serve us to seeing humans as part of nature. So I'm going to combine a few things here. From Courage, Mibare Wanda says, in your global strategy to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, how do you propose integrating actions across the 3 key levels of human impact: individual behaviours, national policies, and international agreements, to ensure that there are synergies and avoid silos, especially for developing countries? So go on, Harvey. How would you answer that one in a few words? What's your global strategy across those 3 levels?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, and biodiversity conservation are the same topic. They're not separate topics. But right now we've been treating them like separate topics. So, for example, the SDGs don't refer to the Global Biodiversity Framework. They do refer to the Paris Agreement, but they don't refer to the Global Biodiversity Framework. Until very recently, we treated the climate and the biodiversity conventions as separate items. I've sat through many negotiations where people stressed how separate they were. Happily, recently, at the Dubai climate meeting, there was a recognition that climate goals cannot be met without meeting biodiversity conservation goals. And finally, the Convention on Biodiversity in Cali, Colombia recently recognized that if we don't meet the Paris temperature goals and think about how the carbon cycle works in relation to nature, we won't save biodiversity. So we have the directional possibility of alignment. And that's how we have to think about it. An easy way to do it, Eliane mentioned NBSAPs. These are the reporting things under the Biodiversity Convention. Well, they could be integrated much better with the reporting done under the Paris Agreement for Climate and reporting done under the SDGs. And then we can start thinking about where the synergies lie, because the synergies are the way out of this problem. And frankly, we can't achieve any of our goals without thinking all this through together. Eliane gave some great examples, but this is actually easier than you think. It's just recognizing that this is a common problem, whether it's human health, like Reina talked about, the stability of the climate, like Johan talked about, or the conservation of biodiversity and the processes that it creates that keeps the world functioning. It's all the same topic, so let's report that way.
Yeah, nice. And kind of picking up on that that kind of interlinked nature of what you're talking about. I think, Johan, I'll pop this question to you from Samuli Korpinen. So we're going to jump to kind of potentially the missing natural processes in the GBF is kind of my tee up. But Somali writes, while all the ecosystems are linked, some are more linked than others, and therefore nature positive actions will accumulate. Would targeting actions to such interlinked ecosystems be more effective? One good example would be the source to sea continuum. Do you have evidence of benefits of such prioritization over actions? Johan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Well, we have quite, well, to start with, from an Earth system perspective, we do see today that in the vast richness of biomes, both on land and in the ocean, the forest systems play a disproportionately important role. And one is carbon stocks. We know that the Amazon basin on its own stores an estimated 100 gigatons of carbon, which is equivalent to more than 10 years of global emissions. And the forests, just as Harvey pointed out, are key to drive moisture recycling. So the Amazon example here is that they generate 40% of their own rainfall. And then connecting back to Raina, these are habitats for biodiversity, and keeping them intact is also a way of protecting us against risks such as fires, disease, and pandemics. So forest systems have a particular, you know, high level priority in terms of earth system regulation. That's not to say that wetlands and peatlands and grasslands and area lands are not significant, but the forest systems are particularly important. And here we have evidence that they have cascading risks with other components of the earth system. So the forest systems are not operating in isolation. We have even, for example, just to give you one example, that if the Greenland ice sheet continues accelerating its melting and slowing down the overturning of heat in the ocean system, this will change the energy balance and therefore shifting the monsoon. And if the monsoon is shifted, this can lead to more droughts over the rainforest systems, both in Congo and in the Amazon, which then would amplify the risks of fires, disease, and droughts, which would pose the stress that Rainer showed earlier, which would then impact on the economy and human health. So you have those kind of cascades. But we don't really have evidence to close this on kind of direct ecosystem level interactions causing similar type of cascades. It's more the big tipping element systems.
Okay, gotcha. And you covered forest systems, wetlands, etc. there. I wonder if I can throw in a question about one of the other kind of three conditions that you were talking about and jump to modern urban planning. So I've got a question here from China who says, in highly urbanized areas driven by economic density, land is extremely expensive. So coming to Rainer on this one, how can we integrate nature positive strategies into modern urban economic planning to safeguard both biodiversity and citizens, especially citizens' mental well-being is the question, without hindering economic development?
I think that's a question for Harvey, actually. I'm going to pass that to him.
Sure. Harvey.
Well, embedded in the question is something interesting. How do we do this without hindering economic development? The right question is, how do we think about our economic development in the context of human health and planetary health? And then as we do that, how do we think about urban areas? Well, urban areas are really important to human, nature in urban areas is super important to human well-being, mental health. We discussed that in the paper. Contact with nature is really important. And urban areas have a huge impact, for example, on the health of estuaries, that source to sea question, where what we do in cities can really impact estuaries. And you'll see that the estuaries and reefs, which are associated with estuaries often, are areas of great ecological degradation where we can improve what we do on land with sewage systems and the farming areas with herbicides and so on that get in rivers, improve the quality of life of people and improve the quality of the environment. And fundamentally, our economic activity needs to keep this in mind all the time. And our problem is that we say, well, the economy has to trump everything. Well, if we could continue letting the economy look like it lives on its own, outside of what humans need and outside what the Earth system needs, we will have a very, very nasty problem. And we don't want that. So we need to just imagine these questions and how can we flourish? How can we have wonderful economic activity while we're thinking about these questions every minute of every day? That's the shift we need to make.
Thanks, Harvey. And let's stick with this kind of rewiring of the economic system for a second. I'm going to combine two questions. I'll come to Eliane for the first one, and then I'll come to Marco for the second one. Right, so here we go. So from Shemba Andrew, biodiversity loss is often driven by economic incentives. What innovative financial mechanisms can help developing countries scale ecosystem protection while ensuring that local livelihoods are not compromised? And I'm going to kind of combine that with Joel Bateman, who says, how do we build sustainable, i.e. lasting, equitable and context-sensitive incentive mechanisms for halting and reversing biodiversity loss that reach the benefits to smallholders, forest communities and agri-businesses? Eliane, to you.
So one of the key areas is how are we looking at that interface of nature positive work that restores landscapes and how we're looking at credit scoring and unlocking financial opportunities. We need to integrate mechanisms where if the work you're doing has negative effects on natural capital, that increases your risk and increases, the liability related to borrowing, to getting investments. And so we need to integrate the indicators for nature positive, economic growth in how we're unlocking finance and investments. And until we do that, we're going to have economic systems that are going to really foster extractive, degrading economic systems versus nurturing, caring systems that are really scaling nature positive action on the ground. And so that's really the key thing we really need to do. We cannot have investment and financing frameworks that ignore our impact on nature.
I love that concept of caring systems. Yeah. And let me follow up with one to Marco from Suzanne Gustafson, who says, how can a mature business begin integrating nature positive solutions into its operation strategy and decision-making processes? What do you think, Marco?
I think it's straightforward. The first step is definitely look at the pressures, understand pressures of that business on nature, because Not always business is aware of those pressures. What are the negative impacts? And in particular, try to match those impacts to some of the most important dependencies that business is relying on. In fact, when we talk about nature, we come from nature. I come from nature conservation background. But when we talk about nature, we tend to talk about nature per se, which is of course super important. First, most romantic person towards nature and empathetic and everything else. But actually, when we talk about nature, we talk about the material. We should talk about and remember the material value of nature and the contributions that nature provides to us every day, and particularly also to economies and specific businesses. We disconnect so much the health of nature from the health of the economy and the society, individual businesses. We are beginning to discover that when nature is disappearing or collapsing or near collapse, then is when we're beginning to understand. It's always happened, right? When something is missing, then you realize how important it was. So when nature functions are actually beginning to deteriorate, then people are beginning to realize how important those dependencies were, and the health of nature was supporting our lives, so also businesses. There are many examples in the world around at the local level where that new understanding has emerged. The question is, how can we scale all that understanding so that becomes a normal practice to think about dependencies on nature and protecting nature in order to secure those dependencies as a component of the business model of every company, of every operation, from a smallholder, a small farmer, down to the biggest agricultural trader. That's when things will change, the mindset shift, because it is about the economic model. Sometimes we're using these big words that honestly, for many people down on the ground, sounds so abstract and remote. It's actually about individual livelihoods, individual profitability, individual business resilience. That's where we need to make the connection between nature and the economy at that level, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Here. And I think Sonia Serra makes a similar point. Why do we continue to separate the word human from nature, as you say, kind of talking about nature per se? Okay, Raina, question to you from Alexandra Mallet, who says, have you seen any policy changes, for example, in Australia or elsewhere, that make the assessment of the potential for zoonotic spillover into humans a mandatory part of an environmental impact assessment for proposed development projects?
I haven't. And actually in Australia, it's interesting that even though we have this very strong empirical evidence of the role of intact winter habitat decreasing the risk of Hendra virus spillover, it's very difficult to actually bring that into policy. And it's, in part, it's because that the special interests around clearing of land for economic development, agricultural development are very, very strong. And it's very, very difficult to make that sort of land use change policy. And unfortunately, human health hasn't risen to the importance of inspiring that. I think there are some really positive developments, though. The pandemic agreement was signed by over 100 countries last year. And part of the pandemic agreement is prevention, including thinking about environmental drivers of spillover. And it's also the concept of One Health. This is the interconnected nature of the environment, humans and animals. And so I think, that was a ratified, is a global treaty that was a binding agreement. And in this age of geopolitical instability, it was a really positive step. And so I think there is actually some hope that we'll see some changes towards spillover prevention coming up soon.
I love that Marco's put his hand up. Over to you, Marco. Oh no, that was a slip of the
Sorry,
hand.
it was a mistake. Yes,
No problem.
yes.
Oh, I loved it. I was like, wow, proper old school Zoom chat.
I mean,
okay, let me put a question to you, Harvey, about scaling this kind of governance beyond jurisdictional borders. From Victor Acosta Chavez, who says a significant portion of biodiversity, including endangered species, exists outside protected areas, often within urban environments where environmental regulations are weak and development is largely uncontrolled. In this context of environmental injustice, how could a nature-positive approach, which seeks to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, change the current trajectory of habitat loss and extinction? Harvey, on that first.
Well, this is the entire point of the three conditions framework as a way of tackling the problem. One is not more important than the other. All of it aggregates to the contribution of biodiversity to a healthy planet. So in cities and farm environments, we need specific strategies that recognize the values, for example, preventing extinction, but we also need to think about the inputs that come from those places that are transferred through freshwater systems to reefs and estuaries, like herbicides and nutrients that we apply to farms or to our lawns or whatever it is. And, you know, one of the things that's really interesting is I was told by a European authority that actually biodiversity in European cities is actually doing a little better than it is in the immediately intensely farmed areas around the cities, because there is already things going on in those cities to try to think more about how biodiversity can flourish in urban environments. And the challenge is we need to think about biodiversity everywhere. A really simple example is if we turned out lights in buildings at night all over the world, the amount of migratory songbird loss would be massively decreased. We would make a real difference if we just thought about that. It would also help the climate, and it would help people's costs. So, you know, just imagining how we live well in the world with nature in the forefront can unlock all kinds of solutions. In China, for example, they've got this concept called the sponge city, which is really about hydrology. And if you get more water in the system, life will do better in the system and you'll reduce flood risk. And there's all kinds of things going on at the municipality level. Sao Paulo in Brazil has quite ambitious nature goals. There's lots of good things going on. We need to aggregate them into, frankly, a global movement that says, this is the future I want, and I want everyone to work with me to get there. That's how we'll get there. And we've laid out a measurable pathway, a strategy across all three conditions, whether it be cities and farms, a source to sea, large wild areas, measurable steps that everyone can get behind and take, ask their governments to get behind, and then we can move this at the high scale towards what Johan talked about, which is getting ourselves back into that stable corridor as much as we can, so that our future of everyone is good and we're healthy.
Eliana, I did see you popped your hand up there, and I would like to come to you for your thoughts on this, and maybe include this question from Dan Reith, who says, how can countries or regions where indigenous knowledge has been largely lost still learn from and apply insights from those knowledge systems? Dan talks about, for example, the Netherlands. There's not really a living indigenous knowledge system anymore. What would that look like in practice? But also your thoughts on the question before that, Eliana.
On the question before that, just to add to what Harvey was saying. So, for example, we need to rethink agriculture and, again, bring, indigenous trees and agroforestry on farms is a really key way we can create corridors for nature. So like Harvey was saying, there are ways we can do that in urban areas. There's ways we can do that in our agricultural food systems, even while we're trying to feed, a planet where we will have 2 extra billion people here. And so how we rethink that will actually nourish our soils, make our soils more productive, more rich, and allow productivity on smaller areas of land, so we don't have to go into deforestation. So really, those are really key areas around how do we look at the health of the landscapes. So that's really important. And the integration of indigenous knowledge is a really key area. So we're in an interesting time where we're in the digital age, where you can AI anything. You can look at all the writings that were, produced in the Netherlands or anywhere in the world over, thousands of years, and really bring back the indigenous knowledge systems that have been shared through storytelling everywhere on the planet. And of course, we also have still thriving indigenous communities around the world. And so, for example, I'm part of a collaborator on a network called Abundant Intelligence that's led by indigenous researchers in North America and Oceania. And it's the interface of how we're looking at indigenous knowledge and artificial intelligence. And they've produced an indigenous artificial intelligence protocol. So we look at how are we integrating indigenous knowledge in this digital age. So there are ways we can bring all of these different knowledge systems together. So it's not about silos. It's about, integration, inclusiveness, and a digital era that is including everyone.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm being told we only have 5 minutes left of questions, which is a pity. So I'm going to try to quick fire some to you because I could chat to you all for hours. Here is a quick one too. Let me give you this one, Raina. From Elisabetta Cora says, rodentation is the other side of defaunation. What do you think? Do you agree?
It is actually. There's actually really good evidence that as you fragment and disturb habitats, that rodents do really well. They're competitive dominant species. And rodents, when their population sizes increase, then also increase the risk of spillover. A couple of really good examples. Actually, one really good example where I'm actually living right now is Lyme disease, where increased white-footed mice actually increase the prevalence of Lyme disease, and the loss of biodiversity, particularly in fragmented habitats, then reduces the ability to dilute out the bites of the ticks that pass the pathogen between species. So when there's biodiversity, they dilute the tick bites and they reduce the pathogen in the environment, and then they reduce the risk of spillover of Lyme disease to people. So biodiversity is incredibly important for stopping these rodent-borne diseases.
Thank you. Here's my quickfire question to Johan from Colin Moffat. Given that the human population is predicted to grow by a further 2 million, as Aliane just introduced us to, and nature will basically have to reset itself to a planet that is 2 degrees C warmer on average, and the various tipping points that you talked about, Johan, may be triggered, can we restore biodiversity? Or do we need to consider what a new biodiversity might look like? Colin goes on and says, and then work to understand how to support that. Is restoration fully practical if the Earth system itself is fundamentally changing?
Yeah, thanks. So that's a big question. To begin with, it's certainly 2 billion, not 2 million. So we're 8 billion today. We may be heading towards 10 billion. The best projections show that we may be peaking actually already at 9.5. When it comes to 2 degrees, the latest scenario shows that we can still avoid 2 degrees Celsius. We're heading towards overshoot, peaking at best at 1.7 and then coming back to 1.5. But despite that, meaning that we may not go to 2 billion more people and 2 degrees Celsius, but could perhaps deviate slightly away from that, we would still be heading into danger. And the answer is that the best science shows that, yes, we can feed a 9 billion co-citizens on planet Earth without expanding into nature. So Elian is absolutely right. We have the practices for sustainable intensification with better crop rotations and building better biodiversity productive systems that can, if we also shift diets towards more plant-based diets, which in the chat have been coming out very actively, it is possible, and we can therefore also restore large parts of nature. And one should recognize, though, that lost species are lost forever, so we cannot return to some virgin state. The best we can do is to maintain the Earth system in a manageable state that does not tip over and drift away irreversibly towards unlivable conditions. That window is still open. So we're talking about a manageable future within a range of nature that to large extent can be restored, but is still, let's say, in a functional level that can uphold stability.
Mm-hmm. Right, panelists and everyone watching, I'm afraid I'm out of time. There's been so many brilliant questions today. But before we go, panelists, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. So one point that you want to just say at the end, one reflection that you'd like to leave viewers with. Let's start with you, Marco Lambertini.
Thank you. So I think maybe I'll mention the elephant in the room, which is the question, is nature positive at all possible? Is becoming nature positive at all possible? And I think the answer is nature positive is necessary. That's my living word.
I love that. It's a great thing to pitch up for the for the other experts to talk about. Marco Lambertini, thanks for joining us. Dr. Eliane Ubali-Duro, Eliane, what would you be your final thought?
I would say not only is it possible that the science shows us that different landscapes have different ways of contributing to nature positive systems, and we need to respect those and we need to integrate them in how we're looking forward. And I've noticed some questions on veganism, and it's like, we need to respect how different populations around the world are looking at regenerative systems. Going vegan may be one, but there are other ones. We need to be really careful around how we're looking at indigenous knowledge systems and how they've worked with nature over time, and how do we integrate that in our economic systems where we need to feed a growing planet, but we have the science to do things right. The issue is, can we link that science to financing and investment mechanisms that only invest in nature positive systems? And that's the shift we need to make.
Oh, Eliane, I could hear you talk all day. I love your energy. Dr. Eliane Ubali-Duro, thank you so much. Johan, let's come to you for your final thought, please.
Science is clear that returning towards a safe and just operating space on Earth is necessary. It's an existential threat we're facing, but it's also possible. And we know that once we are across the hump in that transition, we will all come out more prosperous and in a more equitable world.
Professor Johan Rockström, speaking fantastic truths as always. Thank you so much for joining us. Raina, over to you for your final thought.
Sure. Well, human health would be a great co-benefit of a nature positive approach. And to reduce the probability of another pandemic, we need to protect, restore, and keep intact systems intact.
Professor Raina Plowright, thank you so much. And the final words then to you, Harvey.
Well, the big point about nature positive is it's positive. We do not have to accept that the world is going downhill and that we're doomed. What we can get behind is an idea that can work. We know it can work. You've heard of the various ways that we would benefit from it. The only thing that stands in the way of it is inertia and an addiction to the status quo that isn't working for us. So let's get behind an idea that can change the world for the better, and we can look our grandchildren in the eyes with pride. That's what nature positive is about.
Dr. Harvey Locke, thank you so much. Right, everyone, I hope that's made you all feel nature positive. Thank you, experts, for an absolutely fantastic session. And thank you all watching for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Please do go visit the Frontiers in Science website to read the article that we've discussed today and go explore all of the related content in the hub. From the entire team at Frontiers, who've done an incredible job. Again, thank you all so much. And from me, Greg Foot, thank you, expert guests, for a brilliant session today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.